that was a very generous and lengthy introduction. I come here because I love this program. I love what Diana is doing as a visionary leader, and I love working with fellows. As you're going to be hearing from these guys in just a few minutes, but I just want to say a word about Compass, because we're an organization that's kind of unique. We were formed actually almost 20 years ago by a scientist you may have heard of called Jane Lubchenco, who was responsible for bringing in her sort of best friends into, look, we're going to change the world. We're going to start thinking about how do we communicate more effectively, and really it's all about putting your science to work and finding the conversations for you to engage in, whether it's with ranchers or community folks or journalists or decision makers. You know, there are many, many different ways that you can change the world, which is what we're in the business of trying to do. So as Diana said, tonight our focus is going to be on thinking story like a journalist. And we try to mix it up each year. This is going to be a little more playful. It's experimental. The way that it's going to work is that we'll do a bit of an introduction. Then you're going to hear from these folks. They'll introduce themselves. We'll ask a few questions. And then I'm going to open it up to you, once we've talked a little bit about stories, to have an opportunity to take 2 minutes to pitch what you think might be an interesting story related to the work, the research that you do. And then you will get feedback on what they found interesting and maybe where they could go with it and who it works for and who it might not. Because they're all very different. They're all like, there's a taxonomy here. I did want to say that the reason that we're all here is because each year we launch this program of the Sustainability Fellows. And I think they're all here in the front row, is that right? Do you guys want to just stand up for 1 minute and just turn around and roll? So this is a competitive program, and it's super interesting because it is across all sorts of disciplines, ranging from chemistry, engineering, ecology, human health, social sciences. And so a big part of it is also bringing together these disciplines to think about communicating to the wider world, but also finding new synergies amongst themselves. And I think there are also some past SoGES Fellows in the room as well this year. Would you just quickly stand up? Anybody from previous years? Nice to see you. And note, we'll get into that.
One of them went to the dark side.
All right. And just a nod to Diana and Alita and Laura, who run this magnificent program and have made such a huge investment. And you know, it's being replicated because what they are doing here with this program. In fact, right now, Diana's been working with me to help UBC and Simon Fraser and the University of Victoria to try to do something like this model, and she's been having conversations with them. So you guys are really in the forefront and doing important and good stuff. Okay. So, what is thinking story like a journalist? Well, let's hear from these guys. There's no going back to Kurt. All right, so we are extremely lucky to have 5 very diverse journalists here with us tonight, who are also going to be with us over the next couple of days. And so I'd like to start with just a few introductions, and I'll let them introduce themselves because I think that's way more interesting. I'll ask them each to, in less than 2 minutes, describe what you do. Who do you think of as your audience? What do you love most about being a journalist. They came here. And why did you come? Why did they bother coming? This is not like, part of their day job. So let's start, David,
Okay.
with you. And he's timing himself.
All right, so I'm David Belicoff. I'm an editor on the news section at Science, which is the part of the magazine, the journal that most people actually read. Not all that stuff at the back. I'm responsible for coordinating our coverage of policy, energy, and environment. And I run an online blog called Science Insider, which basically covers anything that is not research news. So it's policy news, it's community news, misconduct, all those kinds of wonderful stories. We really have three audiences at Science. The largest is our online web audience. Almost all of our news stories are available free to anybody on the web. We get 4 to 5 million unique visitors a month to those stories, and those can be anybody from a 6th grader to a policymaker. It's a hugely diverse audience. The second largest audience are the print subscribers to the magazine. That's about somewhere between 100 and 150,000 folks, mostly PhD scientists, mostly working at US institutions from all fields. And then the smallest audience is, there's kind of a hardcore science policy audience, which is kind of my audience, and it's made up of people like research provosts at universities, people who do government affairs at DOE national labs, congressional staff, executive branch staff, maybe no more than, say, 10 or 20,000 people probably across the world. We also cover European politics and things like that. So very diverse audiences. What I love about being a journalist is that I have a 10-second attention span, so I get to move on very quickly when I get bored of doing something. And I come because I think it's really important for folks in the sciences to be able to explain in a compelling way what they do, and I get great stories out of it.
Thanks, David.
Hilary.
Hilary.
Hi, I'm not going to stand up. I'm Hilary Rosner. I am a freelance magazine writer, which used to mean that I wrote for actual print magazines. Now it means I do the kinds of stories that used to run in print magazines, but more often are mostly online. I write about mostly about conservation and biodiversity issues, all about environmental issues, some energy stuff. And I am also an editor at the website Biographic, which is published by the California Academy of Sciences. And I am currently a Scripps Fellow in Environmental Journalism at the University of Colorado, which means I get to kind of take a year off and audit classes and work on a project. I also have a master's in environmental studies from the University of Colorado, so I have a little bit of a science background. My audience, I write for a wide variety of places, everything from National Geographic, Wired, Men's Journal, New York Times, so those are obviously kind of general audiences, to more sort of sciencey. I write for Scientific American. I write for a website called NCIA, which is much more of a kind of wonky, like, policy audience. So it really depends on the kind of, the audience depends on which publication it is. I kind of love the same thing as David. I have a really short attention span. Whenever I'm out in the field with scientists, I'm always like, oh God, thank God I can just do this and then go home and write about it. I would never do this for weeks or months at a time. So I love that I can just kind of like dive in, learn a ton about something, and then sort of move on to the next thing. And I came because I also think this is super important. It's so important for you guys to know how to talk about your research in a way that is not jargony, that makes the public understand why it's important. And also, I'm really inspired by you guys and what you're doing. So I'm grateful to be here.
Thank you.
I think I'll stand just for the folks in the back row. Get your attention, get you engaged. My name is Jeff Burnside. I've spent a lot of years as a television news investigative reporter, and that's the part of the newscast that gets to sink teeth into a big topic and work for weeks or months on any single given story, hopefully have more of an impact. In television news, we don't have the luxury of specializing, but certainly environmental and science issues has been a focus of mine for many, many years. Our audience is, I like to call them the folks sitting down at the couch who have no idea what the next story is going to be in the newscast. That's a really valuable thing because it's not self-selecting. You don't select the headline you're interested in, you don't select the film or the magazine cover that you're already interested in. So we can engage with outside the circle, outside the choir, and the tools in television news are so powerful. You know, you can literally transport someone to a coral reef in a manner that you can't do with any other medium. And again, these are people who hadn't normally necessarily had an interest in coral reefs. So I think that niche is incredibly valuable. It's becoming more and more difficult these days in TV news, as we all see, for better or worse. It's still how most Americans get their news, whether they initially see it online or happen to sit down and watch a newscast. I love being a journalist because I'm a Watergate kid. I got into the business because I want to make the world a better place, as all of these people do. And so being able to share this, I call them the most important stories on the planet, environmental stories, because they literally are. And I think telling those stories is vitally important. I also like, you know, outing the bad guys too. I really like shining the spotlight where it hasn't been shown, or to catch the bad guys. I mean, I really like doing that. So if I'm knocking on your door with a camera, you must have done something wrong. No, I'm just kidding. So I came here. I've been working with Nancy for 17 years or so, and we've gone all over the world together, meeting brilliant, talented, smart people like you who are saving the planet. I think that's so cool. I love meeting you guys and hearing what you're doing, and I feel reassured that the future is in relatively good hands despite what we read. And of course, selfishly, I get tons of story ideas about it as well, whether it's a specific story that comes from your work or just a greater enlightenment of a topic that I might find myself covering a year or two later. So thank you for all that you do.
Hey everybody, I'm Grace Hood. I work at Colorado Public Radio. I'm the energy and environment reporter. I started about 3.5 years ago, and I didn't really know much about energy and environment. I've covered some energy topics here around Colorado, but I've pretty much learned on the job. And our audience, when I describe my audience, I feel like it's almost a window into how journalism is changing, because when I started in public radio about 10 years ago, the web wasn't even really part of what we did. And now I'm expected to file a radio story, I'm expected to take pictures, I'm expected to rewrite my radio story for a digital audience, I'm expected to tweet. So we really are working on these two platforms. And on top of that, we're getting into the podcast realm at Colorado Public Radio. That's long-form audio storytelling. So it's really a matter of, as we're listening to your pitches, keep in mind that there's it's about understanding who you're pitching to, and your story can be told in a lot of different ways. So I think that's really cool. I love being a journalist because have the perfect job. I love working with audio. I love meeting new people. I was hanging out with these two sisters who started a wild horse rescue outfit by the Utah border a couple weeks ago. I also got really excited because I have a feature airing on Thursday, and an air conditioner features prominently in one of the quotes. I love finding ways to get natural sound into stories. So that's what really gets me going. That's probably what I'll be listening for in some of your pitches as you're talking to us. And I came here because it's so much fun to talk about science. It's great to find people's passion in what they're doing. And I'm just really excited to hear about some of the projects that you're working on.
Thank you. Katie.
So I'm Katie Langen. I am a former SoGES Fellow. I was part of the inaugural group in 2011, I think it was. And I did my PhD at CSU, so I see a lot of friendly faces in the audience, which is nice. And as David mentioned, now I'm converted to the dark side. So I'm a journalist now, and I work as a writer and editor for the careers side of the news team at Science Magazine. And so I work in the same newsroom as David, but we actually have our own section of the website, section of the magazine. And what we are interested in doing is writing and editing stories that really focus on topics that will be useful and interesting to people in the academic community and people in science careers at all stages, really. But we think of our target audience as graduate students and postdocs, so really early career individuals, and so we write a lot of stories about, how to navigate career trajectories, how to make decisions, resources that you can use, that sort of thing. What do I love most about being a journalist? I love a lot of things. So I've always loved writing. I really like that on a day-to-day basis I get to turn to a new topic and learn about something completely different. But I think what I'll mention is actually something that I didn't anticipate liking so much about my current job. So my job involves doing interviews and talking to people about personal details associated with their struggle in science. So we really are interested in the humanity of science, kind of the story behind the scenes. And I've always really loved, just over beers, talking to colleagues about their career path and what they're going to do and struggles that they've had. And I guess I didn't really realize when I accepted this job that would be what I really loved in this job as well, where I spent a bunch of time today interviewing scientists about things that they've struggled with and how they've made decisions. And I guess it's something I always loved, but I didn't really realize that was something that I should key in on as indicative of a future job path. And so I've really enjoyed doing that.
And it doesn't come with the beer.
No, I did not have a beer while I So why did you come? So one really great thing about my current job is that the news team is letting me telework from Fort Collins, and so I get to work here. So I actually just had a 5-minute bike ride into campus for this, and I think it's a great program. I got a lot out of being a SoGES fellow. Admittedly, I didn't feel entirely qualified to stand up here when I was first invited, and Nancy and David had to kind of give me a pep talk to say that I should do this. So anyway, I'm happy they did that, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Kate. Okay, so thinking story like a journalist. I'm going to next ask a few questions to get the juices going, getting you thinking about stories, and then I'll open it up for a few questions, and then we'll go on to our next part. Okay, first question, and let's just do it round robin style. What do you look for in a story? David.
I like things that are counterintuitive.
Yeah.
No, that one's taken.
Right. I like something that makes me think about things in a new way. Maybe something I already knew about, but I never really thought about it in that particular way.
And I was going to say new, but also in the sense of new information and new knowledge.
It has to be a charismatic speaker, passionate about the topic.
I'm interested in, I think, all of those things, but one thing that we have to do with our stories is key on whether the information could have a service angle, so whether it could be useful for the scientific community to hear about it.
Is it timely? Is it actually news? Is it something that's happening now?
I want a protagonist who's having some kind of struggle, maybe, which actually most science stories have that, but I want some kind of conflict or tension.
Visual.
Sound.
Along the lines of Hilary, we really like personal stories, and so if we can dig up personal stories that would interest our audience, that's really helpful.
Some stories are about joy. I like joy stories.
Yeah, I write a lot about kind of depressing things, so if there's some way to give it a positive spin, maybe there's a human ingenuity component, someone has a new way to solve a conservation challenge, which maybe they're still not going to succeed, but at least we can be happy that they're trying.
And there's a niche of stories we call gee whiz stories, just stories that are just so cool that nothing else matters. It's just amazing.
A strong profile of somebody goes a long way, can teach you about a topic.
I was about to say that exactly. Nothing else is coming to my mind.
Okay, so journalists have an expression that says show, don't tell. So I'd like you each in 1 minute or less, tell us about a story that you did that you are particularly proud of or are excited about, and a bit about the story behind the story. And maybe what I'll do is, instead of starting with David, I'll start with Jeff.
I think one of the stories I'm most proud of, in fact, you've seen this story, it's a story about an artist named Sam, who was a self-taught painter, and he had this great love of the Everglades, and he painted pictures of the Everglades. And they were gorgeous and huge and magnificent. But the story really wasn't about the artist. It was about what he painted and taught us, non-artists, how to see the beauty in the changing environment. And he was a spectacular, charismatic storyteller. The visuals, of course, were there. We went out of the Everglades where he just got us all to appreciate the majesty, complexity, colors of nature. And he famously said, there's so many colors out here. Even the white clouds have so many different shades of white. And he was a spectacular guy. And we had to sneak the story on the side because we knew pitching that idea to our editors would not work. So we did it on our own time. The first time they ever saw the piece was when it was all finished. And they shed a tear when they saw the story. And then he died a few weeks later. They played the story at his funeral.
So I have to follow that up. I was actually going to talk about a story that I have airing tomorrow about a tax increase. But I got to venture a little bit outside the energy environment realm, and CPR has these election road trips that they sent reporters on. And so I got to go to the Nebraska border, and I didn't really know what I was going to be reporting, but it's related to the election, and it's really about just small town America. How do you save a financial county that's just crumbling? Nobody wants to live there. We couldn't even find a restaurant that was open when we were there on Sunday night, the photographer and myself. But the thing I loved about it was, so there was the air conditioner that played a role in the quote. But the other thing that I love about reporting is that it can really be an adventure. I thought this tax increase, the county is saying we're going to have to go down to 4 days a week. We just don't have any money left here. And I was just, I was totally buying that argument. And then I go and talk to the only retail marijuana shop in town, and they're saying this is a horrible idea. This is going to kill our business. You should look at X, Y, and Z. And I love just the adventure of reporting. And then to be able to bring back just all these diverse voices and to have some rich sound is just exactly what I'm looking for in a story.
I'll mention a recent story that I worked on that I really enjoyed. It was about something called the National Postdoc Survey, and it looked at a number of different things related to postdoc life in the US. But the thing that I was really interested in and zeroed in on was numbers about postdoc salaries. So, everyone knows postdocs, usually don't make very much. And what was interesting about this survey was that they not only had data on postdoc surveys, but they adjusted them to control for cost of living. And so the numbers were really eye-opening when you looked at it. Basically, a postdoc salary in San Francisco or New York was just over $20,000, but after you controlled for cost of living, and that was basically $30,000 less than you would get if you were living in Laramie, Wyoming, where cost of living is a lot lower. And so the data were interesting, and I worked with the graphics team to create some visuals surrounding those data. But what I really liked was talking to postdocs who had lived through that. So I talked to a number of postdocs in the San Francisco Bay Area and postdocs who had lived in New York City, and talked about how they really struggled to make ends meet. And I couldn't believe how many people told me stories about side jobs they had to take on in those places just to get by. So the personal aspect of that story I found really interesting to work on, and I got a lot of good feedback from people that they resonated with the message that came across in the story.
First, I just want to note that Katie was grammatically correct in her use of the word data. Yes. Which almost no journalist is, including myself. I'm going to spend 20 seconds talking about two different stories. So the first story that comes to mind is one of the first big feature story I ever wrote for Science Magazine nearly 30 years ago. It was an idea story, and the editor called me up and said, "Hey, can you write a story about whether you can drive a marine species extinct?" I said, "Well, of course you can drive a marine species extinct. I'll write your story." So then I started calling around and discovered actually that there was a huge debate within the marine science community about whether you can actually drive a marine species extinct. And there are a lot of interesting reasons on both sides about why some people thought you could and other people thought it was going to be incredibly different or difficult. And that story has had tremendous resonance. To this day, it still gets cited and people still pull it up. And so that was an idea story. A person story was a story that was brought to my attention just tonight by somebody who remembered it. And it actually was one of my favorite stories of all time. It was about a guy named Dave Roskin, who used to work for the Forest Service, got very interested. He watched all his favorite forest streams get destroyed while he worked for the Forest Service. So he got very interested in doing river restoration. And basically, he pioneered an entire industry. And by the time I wrote about him, he was extremely controversial because he had pioneered this billion-dollar industry of doing stream restoration. But many academic geomorphologists strongly disagreed with his methods and his analysis. But it's, as the person who reminded me of this story pointed out, it's probably the only time we've gotten the phrase high puke factor equations into the pages of Science magazine.
So the story that popped into my mind is one I wrote probably almost 10 years ago at this point, but it's a story about fish. It was a story about a endangered fish in the Colorado River called the razorback sucker. And the story originally was, what intrigued me about the story to begin with was the way, what had actually happened to this fish and the way that researchers were trying to save it. But once I actually went out and reported the story on the ground, it kind of became, it turned out that one of the scientists who had devoted his career to saving this fish was getting ready to retire. Like, this trip to this lake that we took was his last trip. And so it became this story about these two scientists who had kind of like spent their career, decades, trying to save these fish, which were basically now worse off than when they had started. And so it was this story about the kind of, the sort of emotional issues related to that. Like, what do you do if you're kind of constantly fighting this uphill battle? So it was about the fish, but it was really about these two people.
Cool. Thank you. Okay, so you're, Hilary, both a writer and an editor. And David, you're both a writer and an editor. And so that means that other journalists pitch you stories. What are common pitfalls that would make you decide to give a story a thumbs down versus things that you really like to get when you get a story pitch?
So I'll go. So, there's so many pitfalls. One is pitching.
There are more pitfalls than there are peaks.
One is pitching a topic rather than a story, and so the difference would be, pitching. Oh, I want to write about this endangered species versus I want to write about this particular endangered fish because X, Y, Z. Here's the protagonist. Here's why this is important. Here's what's going to happen in the story. Another pitfall is not realizing that the publication has already done a story on this topic or a kind of similar story, so sort of not having done your homework. And I'll just mention one more, which is not writing a well-crafted pitch. So I get really annoyed if there are typos, punctuation errors, things like that in the pitch, or also if it's just kind of boring. Like, your pitch should be something that shows that you are a writer that people would want to read.
So that I just have to recall that Jennifer Balch, who's a scientist at Boulder, once after she did one of her workshops, wrote a pitch note pitching the fact that she was going to the Amazon to do research. And her subject line was, "Scientists burning down the Amazon."
That's a pitch.
That's, delete. Yeah.
So at Science, a common pitfall for people who pitch us is they don't have a strong research angle to the story. So it will be maybe a good environmental story, or maybe a good human interest story, or maybe a very important social problem, but they have not told me what is the research angle. Our audience are mostly researchers. They're interested in what's the science here that's being talked about. So that's a pretty common pitfall. When I was at NPR, an extremely common pitfall was, where is the audio aspect of this story? How are we going to turn this into an audio story? This might be a great visual story for Jeff or a great print story, but it's going to be really pretty dull as an audio story.
Yeah, Chris Joyce, who does a lot of these, always says, you know, radio is a visual medium because you're making movies in people's heads. Okay, all right. Questions you'd like to ask before we start the pitching? Yeah, and tell us who you are real briefly, and please make it a question, not a...
Yeah.
Or harangus.
I'm Holmes Ralston. You don't want to know this. I'm a philosopher. Does it ever occur to you guys and gals that you make science writing so challenging that the routine scientists will say, look, I'm not up to that. I just better get on with my ordinary research and get published. I mean, you make it too hard to do. The guys who ought to do it don't want to do it, right? Or what?
Okay, reactions. Jeff, then Katie.
So I think that used to be more of an issue, and people like Nancy who are traveling the world, getting terrific scientists to know that they can do that. And with the enormous number of outlets, whether it's social media or news outlets, there's so many different avenues for getting out those stories and doing it in different ways. So it's daunting and it's challenging for some, but I would disagree with your premise that I think it's very doable for a lot of these people. I'm not worried about it.
Katie.
Okay.
So we actually run a lot of personal essays that are written by scientists. So if you have a physical copy of Science Magazine, the very last page is
Yeah,
called the
I read.
Working Life section. So we run stories that are authored by scientists telling their personal story, and you know, we sometimes get submissions that aren't very well written, but we edit them and work them into shape to get them into the magazine. And so it's actually more important for us to have someone willing to share a personal story and to have a strong personal story than it is to have strong writing ability.
Good, thanks. Yes.
So
And who are you?
My name is Trevor Even, and I'm a SoGES Fellow. My question is also kind of philosophical, I guess, in that I feel like oftentimes the sort of task put before us in communicating with the public is finding simple ways and personable and very personal ways to communicate about what we're doing. What does it mean to people in their daily lives? However, a lot of the, I guess, take-home message that a lot of research people in this group do is that things are incredibly complex and that sometimes you can't predict the outcome, and so you have to plan for a range of possible outcomes, which is kind of the opposite of narrative thinking. And so I guess, how do you guys see us both coming together to figure out how to communicate complexity in ways that doesn't just shut people's brains off? There is a way.
Well, so I mean, I don't do news. So I kind of have a little bit of I do long form features. So like I have the luxury of being able to get into that a little bit. And one of the things that I like to do is try to explain to people like how science works and what the different steps are and like what it is actually like to be out there in the field gathering information. And you know, I think that kind of helps like lift the curtain, like a little bit like we were sort of talking about how journalism works, right? I think it's important for the public to understand how science works, and that can kind of go a little ways towards, you know, hey, there's not necessarily a cut and dry answer, but here's how you can kind of understand a little bit about how the process works.
I kind of hear two related but different issues in your question. So one is the issue of complexity. And so, yes, distilling complexity is hard. And it's not about dumbing it down or even simplifying. It really is about distilling it to separate out the pieces of the complexity that are important for your particular audience to know. If your audience is a policymaker, it's very different from a 6th grade class, right?
Say it succinctly.
Yeah, but the other piece of your thing is not about complexity, it's about uncertainty. And uncertainty is a very different issue. And actually, I think it's much easier to communicate with people about uncertainty because they face it in their own lives all the time. Anybody who's bought life insurance intuitively grasps uncertainty. right? I mean, that's what life insurance is. It is a way of hedging against uncertainty. So I think there are lots of ways you can connect to people around uncertainty that is not particularly threatening or challenging. It can be very sobering, but you can do it.
I'll get you a.
Well, this is actually.
Who are you?
Sorry. Hi, I'm Jessica Witt. I'm a vision scientist here at CSU. I'm in the psychology department. And it relates to the second interpretation of that question, which is, as scientists, we never say, our conclusion is boom, but rather, it could be possible that things like this might happen.
Yeah, we've noticed.
There's a lot of that on the floor in the cutting room.
Yeah, there's this tension between what scientists are comfortable saying and what journalists have to say to reach audiences. And I wondered if you could talk about that tension and how to handle that as a scientist.
Sure, I would just say real quickly that, radio and TV is probably the briefest form of major media, and therefore the most frustrating for you. But, we do, every day we work at distilling topics down to a bare minimum. And I think generally the people that we've worked with are surprised and pleased by the way we've been able to convey in so few words this complexity. Yes, I've often tried to push scientists to say it will happen, and the good ones push back with nuance, and we get it. Our editor might not get it, but we're the conduit between the two, and what we say generally goes.
Yeah, the other thing that pops into my mind is developing relationships with journalists. I mean, you want to work with people who are sweating the details, who really do care. It is a balance that we're having to strike, but you want to feel comfortable putting yourself out there and giving an interview to a journalist that is going to represent your work accurately. So, yeah.
I think it's also just a sequencing issue. Scientists often tend to lead with the caveat and then get to what they know. Lead with what you know and then caveat.
I have a really good example of that. There was a scientist named Andy Dobson who wrote a review with many other authors looking at the implications on health of climate change. And I was working with him to try to distill out of that huge review paper what was his main message. And he just could not do it. We talked for 3 hours. He kept going, and finally, at the very end, I said, come on, Andy, what's the bottom line? He goes, a warmer world is a sicker world. And, that wasn't true 100% across the board, right? But it was generally true. So he started with that, and then he could add his caveats as he went deeper into the conversation, the exceptions. But so it is really important, I really want to emphasize what David just said. Really think hard about what you can say, and then add your caveats, if you must.
Didn't that phrase become a New York Times headline?
If you actually Google it, it's a meme. It's yes. And aren't there any hands on this side of the room, or am I missing one?
There's a different kind of journalism out there about the climate and environment. It's called Democracy Now! It's heard every weekday on over 1,200 stations around the world. It's long-form, full-hour interviews with the scientists. She interviewed Michael Mann just the other day. So this is a very different kind of journalism. No commercials. You can access it 24/7 on the web.
Is there a question?
It's the question of, how do you see Democracy Now! You work in blips. She works in whole hours. There's comprehension to what is presented. She didn't give Michael Mann 2 minutes. She gave him 20 minutes.
Okay, reactions.
I take issue with that because I write long form features, so I write stories that I sometimes spend years on, and hopefully people spend more than 5 minutes reading. So I think there's a lot of, unfortunately, some people don't have the luxury of an hour to consume their news, and so I think there's a value to something like Democracy Now!, and there's also value to a 1 minute story that conveys nowhere near the same amount of information, but enough information.
Yeah, Amy Goodman is very good, and she has a particularly advocacy bent in her approach to journalism, which is nothing new in American journalism or any But she is not the only long-form audio or television show out there. There are actually many long-form shows that have segments of 20, 40, 50 minutes. So I don't want you to leave the impression with this crowd that she's the only one doing that, because there are actually a large number of fairly
She has
long-form.
been at every COP conference that's been held for the full week.
Okay, so let's move on, but I just want to, riffing off of what you said about long form, what I noticed, so one of the things we do is we survey the SoGES Fellows. And what was super interesting is how many of you are listening to podcasts, which are long form audio. Like that is, how many of you here now listen to podcasts?
Wow.
Right? It's a big shift. And that's long form. I mean, you know, just the other night I was sitting outside for an hour on my deck drinking wine, listening to Malcolm Gladwell. And just, you know, it's just, so it's actually kind of exciting because there is this, there's been a lot of contraction, but there's also this expansion that's going on at the same time. And particularly for people like you who like to do deeper dives, there are more and more options. Okay, any questions over on this side? What's going on here? Nobody over here? Okay.
Hi, I'm Megan Jones. A lot of the time when we talk about sustainability in science, we talk about natural science, ecology, various forms of conservation biology maybe. I'm a social scientist, and I often struggle to think about, like, oh gosh, I don't have, my subjects are people. You know, some people think that, like, they go to environmental science to get away from the people. Can you have examples of stories focusing on social science and making it charismatic?
So I will just say that a special issue that Science did, that my colleague Elizabeth Collada ran at Science Magazine on migrations. It was a series of pieces on migrations, which was heavily based in social science. Just won one of the biggest journalism prizes in science journalism. And that was almost entirely based on examinations of social science. And it also reminds me that one of the first stories I ever wrote as a freelancer was all about environmental management is not about managing the environment, it's about managing people. And it was all about that.
Yes.
So I have this
Who are
question.
you?
I mean, I'm Ali. I'm a recent PhD, and I'm a social study. So one thing that concerns me as a scientist when I want to communicate my science is that.
Can you hear in the back?
Should I
Maybe a little louder.
Yeah. So something that concerns me when I want to communicate my science, I work in water resources, is that if I say something and then like next year I contradict that based on new findings, how's that going to work? Something like that. Because that happened with the California drought. They said that they're going to have severe droughts for a couple of years, but next year they had a very wet year and the aquifers were recharged. So how's that going to work?
People have very short memories.
I accept that, but the thing is that I think the element of mistrust or distrust is something that is very important. When you say something, and then a few months later, a new story comes out and contradicts that, then how can people trust science communication?
Well, for one thing, you could admit you're wrong. You know, next time you talk to somebody, you can say, now, you know, take it with a grain of salt, because last year I said the sky was going to fall and it's still there. But now I'm telling you, the earth is going to crack open.
Well, I also think, I think it's actually, something like that is a great way to kind of, take a step back and explain to the public like how science works and how, okay, maybe we can't do these predictions, and get them right every time on a year-to-year basis, but the general climate predictions still show X, Y, and Z. To me, that's actually a great way to do kind of an explainer, what we call an explainer piece, which sort of takes a step back and explains like how this particular thing works.
And also, there are a lot of idiots out there, but let's not underestimate the intelligence of the general population too. They get it. And they face this all the time with the aspirin studies that just came out the other day. Same thing.
I'm saying, in terms of deterministic expression of your ideas or things that or your findings, compared to have a little bit more speculative language. I think journalists prefer to have a deterministic approach. Just say it. Things are going to happen.
I think you should say what you are comfortable saying. Do not assume that you need to say what the journalist wants to hear.
Yeah.
A good journalist will ask you another question, but you should not, don't try to prejudge and prepackage.
Yes.
Just kind of a continuation on, I'm Dylan. I'm an ESS major.
What's ESS?
It's Ecosystem Science and Sustainability. I guess, yeah, my question was just continuation of yours. Have you ever used scientists' like knowledge or their research in one of your articles where you convinced them to kind of like dumb down the title of it, which then kind of made their research look faulty in the same scenario?
Oh yeah, all the
And
time.
do you ever give them any credit for it in your next article that re-explains that they had kind of gone into the idea that it wasn't a direct answer?
Something tells me you're hesitant to deal with journalists.
Yeah,
Well,
Katie.
I have a personal story from the opposite side of the
Uh-oh.
coin. So I was interviewed about my PhD work. This was pre-SoGES training, and part of the reason I did SoGES training. So I was interviewed by this journalist, and I did a genetic study for my PhD, and he kept asking me for details about the genetic study and kept asking the question over and over. I clearly wasn't giving a very good answer. And eventually I said something to the effect of, island scrub jays can't fly. And that's how I was quoted, and you know, he got me to a point where I just didn't know how to explain it anymore, and that's not really how I wanted to be quoted, and I found that to be a little bit frustrating. It was even more frustrating when I looked him up and I realized he had a PhD in biology, molecular biology, so it was clear to me that he knew what I was talking about, but he was trying to get me to say it in a different way. So media training is good.
Okay,
But I,
so
can I
on,
just say also, just
yeah,
one thing,
yeah.
that really gets to what Jeff was saying. Like, I think it is, like, you don't necessarily want to talk to every journalist that comes your way and calls you out. And I think it's really important, and I say this all the time, you know, as scientists, like, you can say no to an interview, and you can sort of take the time to look at somebody's track record before you agree to talk to them. Because just like there are good scientists and bad scientists, there are good journalists and bad journalists.
And on that point, you should not talk to any of them. Only talk to me.
But as is, I think, also obvious now, there's as elaborate a taxonomy of journalists as there is of scientists, and so you have to know that audience. So one of the most important things is actually, you know, read these, you know, the media, or listen, or watch, so that you know who it is that, you know, you're going to be talking to. So I think we should move into the pitching part. Mix it up a little bit. If it slows down, we can go back to some questions. Here's how it works. You're gonna come up, stand right here, so that we can take a photo of you in front of this banner. And I'll time you. You have 2 minutes to tell us about, and remember, it's not the whole story, it's a bite of your apple. Some aspect of something that you think could be interesting. It doesn't have, and you don't have to take the whole 2 minutes. You can give them a chance to ask you a few more questions. And then we'll see who likes what and why. All right, who's the brave soul who's going to start this off?
Oh boy. Yeah.
All right. You told us who you are, but tell us.
Smart to applause before the idea. Okay, so I'm Jessie Witt. I'm a vision scientist, and I'm starting to study the best ways to visualize data. And I am horrified by what I see in the literature already because they're not doing their studies right at all. So, oh, this is already terrible. Basically, when you want, for example, to understand complex ideas and data, you need a good visualization of that. And the scientists who are doing this, some of them aren't scientists, they're graphic designers. And so they don't know what message is actually getting communicated. Some of them are scientists, but they're not vision scientists, and so they don't know how to do the right studies. And we're applying this, we haven't started yet, but we're applying this to climate data. We're also applying it to cancer screenings, and our work with cancer screenings is showing that all these decision aids and tricks that doctors are providing to their patients are making it worse.
Questions?
Yeah, question?
I'm sorry, making what worse, the communication?
Yeah,
of this?
patients'
Okay.
understanding. They understand it worse
Yeah.
with these decision aids like these infographics and pictographs.
Yeah. And is your research finding better ways to communicate, or are you just getting started?
Yes.
I'm curious, how do you know that it's making things worse?
There's no sound in this, by the way. So as a vision scientist, we measure what people can access, what kind of information they can access from a visual display. Could do it with Audition. And we measure two components. One is their sensitivity to the information. So as the information changes, so for example, if there's a cancer screening test, as it gets better, can people access that information? Are they sensitive to the information? Another example would be if you're showing climate predictions, can people access the change in global temperature or the differences in variability as you change that information? And then the other component is bias. And so you can, and those components are separate, and you can affect bias and make people change their responses, but you're not affecting sensitivity. You're not making them get or grasp the information any better. And all the work thus far hasn't separated those components. They just look at one score and it's a jumbled mess of sensitivity and bias.
Okay, so I love this story. Perfect fit for science. I love it for two reasons. One, we have a member of the Academy standing up and saying everybody else's work sucks, which I just love. It'll be excellent for your career. But no, more seriously, it's it's a great story. It's got science, it's got social relevance, it's got policy relevance. It could affect individual lives in very real and concrete ways. So it has lots of elements that I would have to wade through what you are actually doing and figuring out how you would tell this story. But the parameters are clear that, everybody says we're doing a much better job of visualizing. It's the era of big data, we're doing better at visualizing it. Maybe not, says so-and-so, right?
Yeah.
Well, call me maybe.
Anybody else want to respond?
I would also just say, I know there's no sound component, but in radio we also, if you have a paper coming out, we can put that in newscast. If you're here at CSU, that there's a local state component to that. So don't totally rule us out. You probably want to call David first.
Just
Okay.
very quickly, I would say obviously it's visual, so I like that. But we would need also, and I'm sure the others would too, need to find a real human being who encountered this issue and how it affected his or her life.
Okay. But that would be your job, not my job.
Correct. Although it helps. No, you're absolutely right. But it helps if you have some ideas.
Although it sounds like the cancer patients are dead, so it might be hard.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes what they're doing over-screening. They're screening when they shouldn't be screening. So they're not dead, but they're over-tested, so.
Yeah.
All right,
Thank
thank you
you.
very much.
This side.
Oh,
Two on the
oh my gosh, okay.
Leroy's done this.
Yeah, you go first.
All right, so I'm Trevor Even, and I'm a PhD student in the Department of Ecology here in the Human Environment Interactions program, and I work for the Natural Resource College Lab. And here's the story, okay? It's really like a series of stories, but basically a few months ago, my boss got asked by an unnamed Colorado senator, I bet you can guess which one, to help him and his staff understand how people in rural communities across Colorado are responding to changing weather. Not climate, of course, given the risks of talking about that in a lot of places, but weather and how it's impacting them. But second, how are they adapting to the weather challenges they faced in the last 2 decades? And how are they innovating to maintain their rural livelihoods in the face of sometimes tremendous destructive challenges? So we're calling up a bunch of people in organizations and with small farms or farms that are doing interesting work at kind of the fringe of productivity or soil management, talking with them for a little bit, pulling their stories together from around the state, and now this is turning into step one of a much longer process where we go get more long-form stories from them. So that sounds like pretty much what you do
and Luke as well. So what do you think?
I think it sounds very interesting. I think we
Yeah.
should talk. My initial question is, it sounds like there's sort of a patina of climate change around this. You're talking about climate change
Right.
without talking about climate
Well,
change.
people don't experience the climate. They remember the weather.
Yes.
Human beings don't have 30-year
That's a
perfect
soundbite.
memory spans.
It sure is.
It is, yeah,
So
that's
that's
good.
that's it. If you want to talk to people about the climate, you have to talk to them about the weather. So why bother talking to them about the climate?
Yeah.
You know, when it's incredibly politically risky to do so.
I have a question. What is the aim? I mean, what was the senator?
Oh yeah, well so the aim is how can you create policies at the county, state, federal level that encourage innovative adaptations in things like agriculture or ranching. You know, there's a million issues and you can go into the details, but there are a lot of disincentives for really like radical change in these systems. There's a lot of inertia. So how can people trying to adjust to things like extreme drought, you know, find a better pathway forward? And how can maybe the Senate do something useful?
So,
Logistics question, are you recording these interviews?
We're not recording the first batch because they're just phone calls.
And
with
are you
people.
getting permission from the respondents to share their comments?
Yeah, I mean, we do a full consent process in IRB and everything, you know, so it's, down the road, we'll do long form, like hour-and-a-half long interviews, hopefully, with different stakeholders and key resource areas, but first step is just kind of talking to people on the phone, putting together a
I actually would be interested in specifics. I mean, this sounds like a great idea, but have you actually found some crazy, like, agriculture machine that somebody made, or I don't know.
Well, it's
I mean,
nothing
have
so
you found
flashy as
cool
that.
stuff?
I mean, there's like hemp, which is cool, and everybody's excited about it because you can make a lot of money with a little bit of water, which is an important factor in Colorado farming. You know, it's one of the only viable crops in a lot of places that are becoming increasingly dry and in which water rights are increasingly useless. So that's one thing that's always good for some viewership. You've got changes to how ranchers and farmers are thinking about the soil. You know, 20 years ago, even the scientific community thought soil was just dirt, it was dead. You put roots in it and chemicals and stuff came out. Now we know it's alive.
Yeah.
That's a whole like series of science stories. But now ranchers and farmers are getting into this, changing the way they move their cattle, move their crops, till their land, and it's having benefits. But again, there's not a lot of incentives in, say, the Farm Bill to do long-term ecological soil.
Clearly,
Yeah.
we could go on for hours about this.
Yeah.
It's super interesting.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
How many of you could see a way into this story? Okay, to be continued.
All right.
Thank you. Okay, Laura.
Ringer.
My name's Leroy Poff, and I'm a river ecologist, and I'm really concerned about river ecosystem sustainability and biodiversity. And I've been waiting to find a captive audience of journalists to pitch an idea to, so sort of a higher level policy thing, but to give it a name that may be, the issue is really about rivers are crippled by dams, and dams make people poorer. And in preparation for this, okay, can you hear me now?
You can use a microphone if you need to.
You could use the microphone.
Okay, well, I'll talk to you. So the issue that I'm concerned about is that dams cripple rivers and make people poorer. And so why is that? What's the problem? Well, the problem is that when you put a dam on a river, you change its ecological functions, and those functions are central to the provision of ecosystem goods and services that people rely on. There are thousands of dams, large dams around the world, and thousands more are being proposed to be built. And scientists are not really having enough of an input into the decisions about where to put these dams and how to manage them. Well, so what? I did, as a 2004 Leopold Fellow, I did dust off my message box. So, you guys. Yeah, so what? Well, people rely on goods and services that rivers provide for their livelihoods often. And this is even recognized by the United Nations, which has put out sustainable development goals that include explicitly concerned about the sustainability of freshwater ecosystems and the goods and services they provide. Science can tell us how to sustain these goods and services in the face of dam pressures. So what are the benefits of this approach? Well, ecosystem services are free, and once you put a dam on a river, You diminish those services, you have to pay to replace them, or and some can't be replaced, they're non-substitutable. Okay? So letting a river run more freely sustains natural capital such as fisheries and floodplain agriculture.
That was your buzzer, by the way.
That was me? Okay.
They're playing you off.
So the solution, the final solution is, policymakers should require that long-term costs of dam building are taken into account, and scientists should be more engaged on the same level as economists in making these decisions. And there is a science on how to do this. And if you want more information, I'm happy to.
It's your second morning.
Point you to a podcast that I did on river sustainability and climate change.
Okay, two things. You buried the headline at the very end. Your ask was at the very end. Second is you fell into the trap of topic, not story.
Yeah, it was a policy kind of pitch. Yeah.
So wait, to make it work, I mean, so this is a very familiar topic to me. I've written a lot about it, but yeah, I mean, I want a story. And you got to the story at the end, but the question is there a story there? Is there a real movement? Is there any real motion to making that policy happen?
Well, I guess that's the question I would have. One of the reasons I agreed to sort of, do this is to ask, how do you make a policy-oriented story, engaging to, people who care.
Well, so what I would look for is an example where a major funder pulled out of a dam project after this kind of analysis was done because it persuaded them that the costs outweighed the benefits. And that this would be an example of what would have to happen elsewhere.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm not sure there is a good example of that.
That's my fear.
Yeah.
I think it's a tough, so I'm very interested in this topic and I'm writing about, or sort of around this issue a little bit right now, but I think it's a hard topic because so many of these dams are being built in places that have very weak governments.
Mm-hmm.
But I would be interested in an op-ed. Like, I would be interested in reading an op-ed by you on this topic. So maybe that's something that maybe you can take the construction of a specific dam, and it could even be a local one, as a way in to, write this piece from your point of view. Even, for the Denver Post or
Or the conversation.
or the conversation. Yeah.
So I'm from Seattle, so it's a really hot topic, of course, in the Northwest, especially with Elwha and now Klamath, and the debate on the snake too. You mentioned early on that removal of that dams make people poor by and large, and therefore the notion is that if they're removed, it would make people wealthier. I'm inferring for that. That may be a common assumption in some scientific publications, but I don't think the general public has that understanding yet, and I think it's a good story.
Yeah. Well, that was trying to be part of the book, right? The dams make people poor.
Yeah. I think it's a good story.
But it's different in the developing world versus the developed world as well. So it's complex. That's part of it.
I think the journalist would find, especially if it's domestic, a person who falls into each category. Like wheat farmers in Pullman.
Thank you.
All right.
Just thinking about the gender balance. Any women?
Brought your fan club.
Thank you. Hey everybody, I'm Carolina Gutierrez and I'm a PhD student from Colombia with Dr. Belicoff. So I'm going to piggyback off a little bit of what he just said. So I study bugs in the water. I am interested in river health and river conservation, and I study bugs because I want to know what are the different roles that aquatic insects play in different rivers. I come from Colombia, so I come from the tropics, and one of our biggest concerns is that management policies are not addressed specifically to the tropical area. It's just copied off of management and policies made off in different latitudinal areas. So one of my biggest interests is what happens with, starting from the base of the bugs in the river, what happens to the river, and how do we manage specifically in tropical areas. I got interested in this because growing up in Colombia and growing up next to rivers, I've noticed that rivers I mean, we all know that life cannot be sustained without water at all, and so we need it, but it's still less than 3% of water is actually available in rivers and lakes. So we definitely need to conserve that. But in order to do that, we need to know different aspects of it. Most of the research has been focused on taxonomy, so knowing what species are there, biodiversity, but there's another aspect of diversity, which is what are they doing? So what are the roles or functions, which is what I want to know. I also think that, I'm a little biased to it, but aquatic insects are also a great way to get people interested in science at all levels. People, adults who fly fish, for example, the fly fish bait, that's what I'm studying, the bugs that you use for fishing. So I'm studying the buffet of food for the fishes in the water, and if there are no aquatic insects, there are no fishes, people can fish. So, so it kind of cascades down, so I want to start at the base. And I also, more personally, I love the fact that kids, for example, can relate to bugs in general pretty easily. As we grow up, we kind of lose that part. And so as a mom of two who became a mom during my PhD, I saw firsthand the reaction to them in the field. So that's one part that I really want to work on, getting kids interested in science using aquatic bugs.
Thank you.
I'm sure these guys are going to agree, but you pitched you in a topic, not a news story in there somewhere. It might be in there somewhere. In fact, you might be the great story. I remember you from last year, and you have a great story to tell. But I think you were trying to pitch a news story, and I'm not quite. I heard a big topic. Fascinating, but we need a peg.
Katie.
So I actually don't need a peg, I need a person.
Right.
And so I, was interested when you were talking about your personal details growing up near a river in Colombia and wanting to contribute and work with kids. And so if I were, having a beer with you, I would be interested in your research, but I would work the conversation more to, what's your personal story? How did you come here? What motivates you? What do you plan on doing in the future? And so those were actually the parts of the story that I found most interesting, and we don't need a peg, so I would be able to work with you at any time.
I mean, I'm interested, I've written about EvoTrack before, and so I have personal interest in this, but I want to know, I'm sort of looking for, okay, well, so what have you found? What is the thing that you found that might actually help conserve these rivers? I love the idea that, people sort of aren't necessarily studying the right thing, or, all the different things when they're studying a river. I love this idea of, what role are the different bugs playing and why that's important. So that seems like a really good sort of starting point to take us there.
So the science story would be policies developed for northern nations really aren't appropriate for the tropics, but I would need some very specific examples. I would need to see exactly why, and then the differences would have to be compelling enough to carry a story. If they're not very compelling and it's not going to be very interesting, we're probably not going to write about it.
Ask yourself, what's the headline?
Thank you so much, Carol.
So I should preface this with I don't know if this is exactly what you guys are going for.
That's what everybody prefaced theirs with, too.
I'm going to give it a shot. Also, my professor's here, so, I gotta look good.
Who are you?
My name's Aaron Provencio. I'm a fourth-year fish, wildlife, and conservation biology student here at CSU. The reason I'm bringing up this story is because I studied abroad this past spring in Costa Rica and loved my time there, but I stumbled upon a little hidden gem in the mountains above San Ramon, Costa Rica. It's a little plot of cloud forest called the Nectandra Cloud Gardens. And it was established by a really eclectic group of American expatriates, and there was a Costa Rican botanist who studied and learned and apprenticed in the Chicago botanical gardens. And there was a former biochemist who left her job to go down with 3 of her friends and work on this project. And it is a really unique example of not only mixing ecotourism with conservation, but also, I think, a victory for the human dimensions aspect of community involvement. And it was a really unique manipulation of water rights in a place that's primarily dominated by rural agricultural activity, in a way to not only promote shared use of those water resources, but also to promote a maintenance of the cloud forest in that area. from speaking with the people who worked at Nictandra and doing my own sort of research afterwards, I believe, and granted I'm only a fourth-year fish, wildlife, and conservation biology student, so I don't know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm sure a lot of you guys over here would know a lot better than I. But it seems like it's a model that can be replicated, and replicated very effectively in a lot of different areas where we see the conflict between water rights issues and conservation issues as well.
So in the hands of the right writer, it would be a great New York Times travel piece.
Yeah.
Or it would be a great travel piece. You could frame it as a travel piece. Otherwise, you know, I was joking earlier, a friend of mine's dad was a very famous journalist, and she would come home bubbling from school about some great thing that happened to her at school, and he would look at her and go, Katie-O, a great story is a great story. But when something, when something good happens, that's great. But when something terrible happens, that's a great story. So, you know, the downside you face is it's a good news story, which unfortunately does in some ways make it a harder sell.
Sure.
Any other thoughts?
I think you need to think about audience, right? This story might have more resonance in Central America for a Central American outlet than it's going to have in North America for a North American audience. Or it may have more relevance to a water resources audience, a specialized publication that talks to folks who do agroforestry or water resources than a general audience.
I'm sort of wondering, so there's a question that journalists always ask, which is like, why are we writing about this now? And that's kind of the thing that we always need. It doesn't necessarily need to be like something super new that's happening, but there needs to be a reason why I'm telling the story now. And there may very well be, and maybe the reason is because there's all these increasing conflicts between water rights and conservation, but that's sort of the thing that I want to know.
Well, I think most interesting for me was that when I was down there, I got an internship at a wildlife refuge. And the differences in management styles between the wildlife refuge and this, they called the cloud garden, but it was much more nature preserve than anything else, was that in Kuru, where I worked, it was much more of we're doing this for the tourists. In Nictandra, it was a really unique use of, we're doing this for the land. The tourists just happen to be there. And it was funded originally, or it was brought together by this man by the name of Alvaro Ugalde, who was not only a pioneer in this project, but also in the nature preserve sort of project in like the 70s and 80s in Costa Rica. And in the past 10 years, Costa Rica has seen such an influx of international tourists demanding to seep out what Costa Rica has to offer, which is that natural beauty that Nictandra places like Nictandra offer. And I think what was so interesting to me was that Nictandra managed to thrive while mixing both the desires of the tourists who were visiting them and the community members, as well as still maintaining that really positive environment. And I worry because I have friends that I talk to from Costa Rica, and they say, the Costa Rica that is now is not the Costa Rica of 10 years ago. It's agringado, it's gringoed, that's how they would say. And people are coming in and telling us how to manage our lands. And I think that Nictandra is a really good example of how to balance the needs of really diverse populace.
So what you have in spades, which is obvious, is passion. And passion is very attractive.
I was going to say, they should just hire you.
I've been trying. I've been saying, if you know anybody, just...
Okay, thank you very much.
Following up on those responses? Yeah, so both David and Hilary, you guys mentioned conflict, and I guess I'm wondering...
What conflict?
Well, you said like something terrible has to happen, or where's the conflict in this story?
She said something terrible has to happen.
Why can't it be celebration and hope?
Yeah, what about it?
Through those different stories. And how? How can we
change
that narrative?
But I mean, if you think about it's just conflict is something, conflict and tension are like basic elements of narrative. So they're not just elements of narrative for journalism or for science storytelling. That's sort of if you think about the kind of epic novels, and they're all the Iliad, they're all, conflict is sort of at the heart of something that human beings are attracted to, and so you want some kind of struggle. You want to sort of go along with the protagonist as they face some kind of challenge, or there's the journey is kind of a traditional narrative. There's all these sort of traditional narrative structures that you can use, and so in order to get people to sort of read along and have there be suspense and stuff, you need something to pull you along. And unfortunately, the way we're wired, hey, these people did this awesome thing isn't really like, I mean, what I would want to know about the story that he was just telling is like, well, what challenges did they face, right? So maybe the story is that these people, against all odds, managed to like build this amazing place and preserve this land, even though, you know, the government was fighting them and these rich people were fighting them and whatever. And that's sort of what makes it an interesting narrative.
Yeah, and there's a whole branch of journalism. I mean, it's not just about pointing out the conflict and then leaving the reader hanging. There's a whole branch of journalism called solutions journalism, which is about learning from past mistakes. I mean, it's about telling a good story, but also bringing that learning and knowledge to a place where other places can use it. So it's not, we're not just sort of callously using our own devices and wanting to leave.
I happen to agree with you that hope is a powerful topic as well.
It is,
And I do agree. Even hope is hope because it's overcoming it.
Yeah. Hope is kind of a, right, it's a challenge, right?
But
Like
David
having
says science needs bad news.
Well, so working in the policy sphere, you know, one of the things you come to recognize is that so many of the social institutions we have exist to work out, to ameliorate conflict. Politics is a system for ameliorating conflict and doing resource allocation. Criminal justice system is often about ameliorating conflict, right? So, I mean, to some degree, conflict is built into many of the institutions that we have built. So is cooperation, and I agree it is particularly mainstream media, it is harder often to, although not entirely. I mean, good news stories have a real hold on the American people, so, and other countries too. So it's not,
but again, like even those good news stories are sort of, they're about overcoming challenge. Katie.
I have a comment that's a bit of a tangent and it kind of flips it around to you. I actually think that the scientific community could learn a lot from this sort of discussion among journalists about how to tell a story, because when you're writing a scientific paper, it's also good to think about what your story is and if there's conflict involved, and that doesn't mean that you have to present it as this bad news tale or, you know, some dramatic thing happening, but you can find conflict in a lot of places. Like, for instance, you can say, you know, we knew this and we knew this, but, you know, there was this gaping knowledge gap, and, you know, here I come to fill this knowledge gap. And something little like that can create a lot of tension and drama in your introduction of your talk or your paper, and that can really hook people and get them to keep reading because they want to know, you know, what was the solution, you know, how did you solve this problem? And so it's actually something that I think scientists should think a lot more about.
And science actually has, like, the whole arc of the way science works is kind of like tailor-made for a narrative, right? Like, you are all on a journey to understand something. So, you know, it's kind of great.
So that is actually a perfect segue into just a quick little summary of some of the things that we've talked about. Do any of you recognize this person? Nalini Nakarni. Yeah, she works in actually the canopy of, I think she's worked a lot in Costa Rica. Also a Leopold Fellow. Okay. So, going back to the very beginning, what makes a good story when I ask them? It has to be new, it has to be surprising, or that's one way, right? These are just like elements. Solving a mystery, which is, you all are trying to do that. You all have a question that you're trying to find the answer to. Journalists love going on field trips. The quest, scientists to the rescue, science to the rescue, or it can be just plain. But the important thing to remember is that it's not the whole story, it's a bite of the apple. And it's figuring out what is your bite of the apple that's going to resonate with whomever it is you're talking to. And you can see that there's been a huge range. So one time when I did something like this, there was a tweet that came out by Tessa Hill, who's a scientist at UC Davis. And she did a word cloud on what kept coming up. And at the center of it all was interesting people. So one of the things we're actually going to be working on in the next 2 days is, I call it putting the I back in science. Because you have been trained to drum that out of you, right? But in fact, that's what makes it interesting. to other people and is, you know, you're interesting. They might not at first blush not get what their science is about, but it's this passion, this quest, this dedication that you all have that is so fascinating to other people. So thank you for taking a risk, those of you who did. And there are just a couple of things to bear in mind. There's actually social science, excuse me, that shows we remember narrative. We're wired that way. So when you're telling a story, you're taking people on a journey. There is this narrative arc. And you can move them from one perspective to another. I love this quote by Ray Brown. Stories are just data with a soul. So I'm going to just, in absolute closing, ask each of the journalists, you know, you've all done these workshops or attended events where I try to do this kind of, you know, I'm sort of like a matchmaker, right? I bring these journalists in and we get them talking to you. Can you think of an example where you actually went away and found a story?
At a pitch pit?
Yeah. While you're thinking of it, I'll give you an example that, so Kendra Pierre-Louise is a reporter at the New York Times, and she attended a pitch pit that we did at the Society of Conservation Biology conference. And it was interesting because it took her actually a year and a half, the story just kind of bubbled away. So it's like, when you have these conversations, it's often like you're planting seeds. And just last May, she actually went and followed up on this pitch that this scientist had made at the pitch pit. Went into the field with this woman and did a wonderful story. So the whole intent of tonight has been maybe to plant a few seeds.
So I actually edited a story. I commissioned a story after the NACB pitch pit, not this one in Toronto, but 2 years ago. It was a story about logging and the last old growth logging in the U.S. And it was really, really compelling. And I couldn't actually, much as I wanted to do the story myself, I didn't have the time. And so I actually assigned a reporter to go and sent her up to the Tongass, and we did the story for Biographic.
I've interviewed Jeremy Jackson as a result of some of your confabs, talking about health of marine ecosystems, marine protected areas, sea level rise.
One of the SoGES Fellows last year, Jessica, studied air quality, and I didn't interview her, but I talked to someone from her group, a study that they were working on, and it was in a paper that was profiled in CPR's newscast.
Did we do Jennifer Balch?
Yeah.
She did Jennifer Balch,
Yeah.
just this year.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I wasn't a panelist, but I was in the audience during, what was it, the World Oceans
Oh, yeah.
Climate Change.
Effects of climate change on the world's ocean.
So that
Conference in DC in June.
Yeah, in June. So David was a panelist, and I, at the time, was interning at Science, and some people from Bermuda got up Barbados got up and talked about this seaweed that was inundating their island and causing all of these problems. And they talked about it at the pitch pit. And David and I didn't connect that night, but he was really intrigued, and he was going on vacation the next day, so he put me on the story.
I said, let's give it to Katie, she'll eat anything.
Anyway, it didn't turn out exactly how they pitched it, but it turned out that we, they weren't necessarily doing science on the topic, and we're really interested in talking about scientists and what they're doing. And so I ended up connecting with a bunch of scientists that were trying to solve this mystery of why seaweed, which was usually in the Sargasso Sea, was suddenly inundating the Caribbean. And so it turned into an interesting story.
I've written many stories in the 20 or so years that have come out of these pitch pits and interacting with scientists, but yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly rich vein of source of material for me. I'll give an example, a very obscure one at the Wildlife Conference 3 years ago in Wisconsin. I was chatting with a guy in the hall, and he said, I said, what are you working on? He said, oh, we're mired in this, the very first oil sands permit in the United States is about to be leased on BLM land, I believe in Nevada. And I said, oh, well, that's pretty interesting. So I ended up writing it, and what really intrigued me was he told me the site was called Asphalt Ridge, which I just thought was wonderful. So, I mean, where better to mine for oil sands in the United States than at Asphalt Ridge? So I ended up writing a little story about Asphalt Ridge.
And the Super Bowl of pitch pits for environmental stories is coming to this campus in a year, when the Society of Environmental Journalists brings its national, really global conference to Fort Collins. And Diana is helping to put the whole thing together. There'll be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of working environmental journalists right here on this campus, and you guys are all invited to the conference.
So you've had a little bit of a sort of rehearsal, and you can just engage with all those journalists over here.
Or you can just talk to us.
Yeah.
Thank you all for your good energy. Thanks to you all for taking a few risks, asking